Okay, hi everyone. I'm Zubin Master. I'm going to give you a talk on the latest International Society for Stem Cell Research Guidelines as it pertains to the unproven or unapproved stem cell and regenerative medicine treatment industry. So I wanted to declare some of my outside work. I am a member of the scientific society, the ISSCR, the International Society for Stem Cell Research. I am also a Lawrence Goldstein Science Policy Fellow for ISSCR, and the fellowship also permits us to serve as ex officios on the Public Policy Committee. I am a member of ISSCR's Education Committee, and I was not, however, part of the working group that developed the latest guidelines, which I will discuss. And while I've received travel awards from ISSCR for their conferences, I've not, been paid for any of the services or any other service I've mentioned, nor do I have any other payments to report that pertains to this presentation. So what is the unproven, unregulated, unapproved stem cell treatment, stem cell intervention industry? Well, you can see that there's a lot of names, and the nomenclature is to some degree poses a few challenges. So how is unproven defined? A lot of people basically look at unproven as not FDA approved, similar to the term unapproved. But not all products that fall into this space have to be regulated through the FDA. Some may fall outside of FDA regulation, but also it's not only about stem cells. This industry is now taken on acellular, non-stem cell types of products, as well as regenerative interventions that like exosomes that don't have cellular material, that aren't cell-based. There's differing levels of evidence around these stem cell interventions to treat chronic diseases, and I think the easiest way to understand this industry is to first characterize it by outlining a common set of features. So I'll spend a bit of time doing that, and then I'm going to talk about how the ISSCR guidelines try to deal with this industry. So again, this is an international for-profit marketplace. You can see several of the different countries, and this is not an exhaustive list, where clinics selling these unproven stem cell interventions, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be using these terms potentially a little bit interchangeably, are found. So also, this is a direct-to-consumer web-based industry. You can see some of the websites that are being displayed. The clinics also advertise in other different ways. They may have flyers. I'll show a couple of those, news ads. They may be found on social media, and patient seminars are also another strategy. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation in this industry, and in some cases, these clinics literally try to promote distrust of medical establishment. And of course, what they're trying to do is to showcase their stem cell intervention and their practice as if it was scientifically valid. And I'll talk about that in a second, but I just want to show a couple of these different types of advertisements. On the left, you see for various different types of orthopedic conditions. On the right, there's some stem cell packages you can take in Mexico to treat COPD. And here you can see a diagnostic imaging of bone on bone. And then after a stem cell intervention, you can see that there's new tissue separating the two bones. So again, most of the interventions and the clinics and the providers are trying to show these interventions as if they were scientifically legit. We call this tokens of legitimacy, and there's many ways to do it. For example, a clinic may display its award-winning, board of clinical and scientific advisors. They may try to register their intervention on clinical registries, clinical trial registries like clinicaltrials.gov, giving that impression that they are actual, clinical trials, but they are not. They may get ethics review from a for-profit ethics board. But the main way is that last line on the table is the main way of marketing that these interventions are effective to other potential clients is to have testimonials from patients and celebrities. So in 2019, we did an analysis of patient testimonials that were found on YouTube, which is a major social media platform that is used by these clinics. And we analyzed 165 videos of 5 major diseases. And we found a range of different things, but just some of the highlights, we found that overall, the patients inside these videos basically said that they received some kind of an improvement or benefit from the unproven intervention. A lot of patients have complained that their allopathic care team has not given them the hope that they desire. They say there's nothing else that they can do for their chronic untreatable condition. But when they contact or talk with the unproven stem cell intervention providers, the treatment, the provider, the clinic gives them that hope that they yearn. There's also over half the videos showed that the patient showed some type of praise, were thankful, found that the provider was knowledgeable and helpful, and so they praised the stem cell intervention, the clinic or the provider. And almost a third of the videos we analyzed also had the patient recommend the stem cell treatment to the viewer, potentially another patient. And so this is a very powerful way. Narratives are a very powerful tool to convey health information, and can also be difficult to combat in terms of providing fact-based information to correct misinformation. So, we know a little bit more about this marketplace. It pertains to an older population, about 65 years. And many of these patients who seek stem cells are very, the high information seekers. They go on the internet, they look up stuff, they read stuff, they talk to people, they may even do a site visit. There's also been documented physical, emotional, and financial harms to patients. Patients have suffered from various different types of physical injuries, tumors, tremors, lesions. Some have even died. This industry seems to be growing. Just a quick examination of the growth in the United States. There's from 570 clinics to 715 to upwards of over 1,000 clinics today. Most of the clinics are run by physicians, and most of these physicians are male, and many of them are not qualified to be giving the stem cell treatments that they say that their clinic says that they're offering. The market is also evolving. For example, as I mentioned, now other types of regenerative treatments are being given, like exosomes, instead of stem cells, or potentially even in conjunction with a stem cell intervention. A lot of clinics are also starting to get into the business of training physicians to become a stem cell doc, or to potentially store cells in the future as a bioinsurance in case a patient needs a cell therapy in the future. And of course, patient education in this space to sort of counter the extensive misinformation is sparse. It's also very didactic. It's traditional text-based education. It's not very empathically rich, and most likely, but it's unknown or unclear, it's not reaching patients. So, in a recent paper, we actually outlined a need for global deliberation. We took, we said regulatory efforts have been, useful, but they've had limited success because, as I just mentioned, in the case of the US, the industry has continued to proliferate. Moreover, we took our cues from the recent World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee set forth for human genome editing. and thinking that, while of course human genome editing needs a international governance structure, so does the unproven stem cell interventions. And so we outlined several areas that this WHO Expert Advisory Committee can look at, one of which is the harmonization of standards, within and between different countries. So that brings me to the point of the discussion. How does the International Society for Stem Cell Research think about unproven stem cells, and how do they want to oversee this? And why is it important that I even mention one specific society? So the ISSCR was founded in 2002. It has been really at the front end of developing all types of education, guidance for patients, guidance for physicians, guidance for the scientific community, and also guidelines on how to most ethically and professionally conduct stem cell and related research. It began in 2006 by developing guidelines on human embryonic stem cell research. It then started to develop guidelines on the clinical translation of stem cells in 2008, which was reformed in 2016. And that the clinical translation guidelines have just recently been reformed in 2021, May of last month. So the ISSCR guidelines, what do they say about clinical translation, things like that? Well, firstly, they are a major standard. They are perhaps the most international of all standards, because most of the regulations and governance are, seems to function within different nations. The guideline task force consisted of 45 members, and the most recent guidelines received peer review from various ISSCR committees and also international experts and the members of the organization. It has an expansive scope and is continuing to grow as the science continues to evolve. Again, so of course it covers, human embryonic stem cell and other types of stem cell research. It covers genome editing, mitochondrial replacement transfer. It covers, organoids that are grown in culture, and chimeras and hybrids, amongst other areas as well. And the ISSCR guidelines, as well as the National Academy of Sciences guidelines, have really established an oversight body process, an oversight process. And this has many names. It could be the Embryo Research Oversight Committee, the Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee, SCRO and ISSCRO, and Institutional Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee, or an ESCRO, an Embryonic Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee. These various different committees basically use the guidelines to oversee different types of scientific conduct and practices. And of course, the guidelines talk about what is prohibited research, what is permitted research, and also the extent of oversight by these oversight bodies for research that is allowed. Now, on the topic of unproven stem cells, the unproven stem cell and regenerative medicine industry is really an area of concern for ISSCR. The ISSCR clearly says that they condemn stem cell research and regenerative interventions outside of clinical research or medical innovation. Now, clinical research, the goals of clinical research are to get knowledge and to provide products and services for society. The goals of medical innovation are different. They are to help patients. And so medical innovation is to improve patient care within the purview of the practice of medicine, whereas clinical research is an activity that's also with oversight by regulators like the FDA. And so ISSCR condemns unproven stem cell research outside of a clinical research or medical innovation context, especially when it's used to make profit. And their concerns pretty much surround all of the issues and the way I characterize the features of this industry. And so most of these unproven interventions are meant to go through a clinical trials process. But again, as the final bullet says, in some very limited cases, it may be justified to treat a few people through medical innovation. So the ISSCR also calls for greater regulatory enforcement and calls on similar to other academic societies and non-governmental organizations. And when they say the words regulatory, they mean, FDA to regulate and oversee drugs, but also the Federal Trade Commission to look at the advertising practices, and also to look at medical licensing of physicians who practice unproven stem cell interventions by individual state medical boards. Now, ISSCR completely recognizes the value of medical innovation, but it also understands that sometimes these interventions through medical innovation have been either ineffective and or harmful. Now, when I look at medical innovation, I think of one of my favorite shows, The Good Doctor, where it's a team of surgeons that are constantly medically innovating by looking at case reports and trying to help their patients with these very complex and unique issues. So, and medical innovation is kind of like that, but it's certainly not the norm in medical practice. Medical innovation, again, as I mentioned, aims to take care of patients, and it's found in some specialties like surgical specialties more than others. But what happens is the concern that ISSCR, amongst others, have is that medical innovation, if done routinely enough, may become a standard of care. And in that sense, there is less of an incentive for clinical scientists to undertake clinical trials of that innovation in order to scientifically show that the intervention is both safe and effective. Now, in one study of over 3,000 randomized controlled trials, there was about almost 400 drugs, devices, and procedures that were actually shown to be ineffective, and these are called medical reversals. And interestingly, that even though there's evidence to show that these medical reversals, that these interventions are ineffective, physicians still continue to use them in routine care. So again, the process of clinical trials versus medical innovation has some similarities, but of course it has some differences. So clinical trials with the goal of creating generalizable knowledge. The idea is that you have to use preclinical animal and other models to demonstrate safety and efficacy. This can then be then this intervention has to be reviewed by some kind of a peer review body, such as an ethics review and or a scientific review. It then, through the clinical trials process that's overseen by the FDA, and investigational new drug, an IND, is submitted, and the FDA may permit you to go through, phase 1 and eventually phase 2 and phase 3. After phase 3, this is then considered, quote, a proven treatment and can be marketed. Now, the medical innovation is slightly different. It also begins with having some kind of rationale, either based on preclinical or clinical data of safety and the potential to help one or more patients. It too has a similar scientific and ethics peer review process. And then there is medical innovation to actually treat those few patients. And of course, there's also an obligation to report the findings after the treatment of those few patients. Now, what generally should be happening is that after medical innovation, this innovation, this stem cell intervention or what have you, will go through the clinical trials process in order to become a proven therapy. The concern with ISSCR, as I've mentioned before, is the line that they want to try to avoid with the red X. They don't want medical innovation to become standard of care. But this has been a battle in the unproven world, unproven stem cell intervention world, between whose scope of practice it really is. Clinics have argued that, the delivery of stem cell interventions is really the practice of medicine and not within the purview of regulators. However, the FDA has argued that it has the legal authority to regulate anything beyond what it defines as minimal manipulation and homologous use. So if it's used in non-homologous use purposes and beyond minimal manipulation, well, then it becomes regulated as a drug, and you have to get a biological license. You have to go through that clinical trials process. So what has ISSCR done? Well, they've really tightened the reins on how they look at and define medical innovation. So as the first bullet says, medical innovation is rarely ethically and scientifically justifiable. And they outline three practices or three conditions where it may be. So not looking at, not paying more attention than just an explanation. The final bullet there, the third bullet. So outside of something that's minimally manipulated and homologous used, the ISSCR says, well, that's certainly not going to go through the clinical trials process. That's, within the purview of medicine. But of course, off-label and expanded access, both, again, within the purview of medicine, may be the specific conditions that the ISSCR has now stipulated in its most revised guidelines. And of course, even though this is within the scope of practice of medicine, the ISSCR requests that there be oversight over this, there be a written plan, patients be informed and provide consent. There is an obligation to follow up patients and treat any adverse events from these unproven interventions, and of course, report the findings. So between the 2016 and the most recent version of the ISSCR guidelines, the written plan requirements have largely remained consistent. Again, the idea is that there has to be a scientific rationale and some evidence of safety and chance for benefit of that patient. Also, any type of stem cell intervention that's been given can be given after a patient has exhausted conventional medical options. There has to be a protocol written of how this is going to be administered. There also has to be a protocol written for how data will be collected and adverse events will be addressed. There's, of course, a requirement that's put out by ISSCR for peer review, both ethics and the science, and including leadership at the healthcare institution. And of course, the patient should undergo a medical innovation only when they cannot enter a stem cell trial. Additional requirements, of course, they want to make sure people are qualified to undertake it, that consent is being given, that if an adverse event occurs, that it's being addressed, it's being, the patients are being monitored and it's being addressed, but also that the patients aren't paying out of pocket for any adverse events caused by the unproven intervention. There's, of course, a commitment to report the findings, and again, a commitment that after the medical innovation has occurred, the idea is to go and formally test these in well-controlled clinical trials in order to make this therapy proven. And what is not a substitute for clinical trials are real-world data that's collected from these medical innovation studies. They are not a substitute for controlled clinical trials. So to look at some of the issues around off-labeling. So when is it really appropriate to provide stem cell interventions under the off-label sort of pathways? So off-label is when, something has been shown to be proven for a particular indication and has gone through the clinical trials pathway and received FDA approval. It can be given within the scope of medicine for another indication, for another condition. And some data actually shows that in 21% of all medical prescribing practices, drugs are given off-label, of which 73% of those off-label drugs have no scientific evidence. Now, while ISSCR acknowledges that this is an area that will be rarely used, and there's going to be a real need for high quality evidence and a serious scientific justification to use this, I think there needs to be greater clarity, because it's hard to imagine situations where a stem cell intervention may be used off-label. So for example, if there was an MSC trial that was been proven for a particular condition, can that mean that any MSC be used for any other condition, so long as there's some type of a good or thorough, reasonable scientific justification? What is the bar of that justification that is necessary? Also, are MSCs the same MSCs derived in different ways? A cell line versus an MSC derived from a person's adipose tissue. How, what exactly is considered the same drug that was, once used and proven in one trial can be used in off-label. And of course, patients don't really know the difference between something, experimental in off-label versus expanded access versus clinical trials. For them, it's an experimental drug that may help them. And so there's also going to be a high bar to ensure that patients are not confused and they realize that this is an unproven intervention. So there's going to be a heavy reliance on, I think, the peer review process as well as the consent processes to ensure that people are well informed, patients are well informed, and that there is significant scientific justification, such that again we're not adding more to that unproven interventions. Now, the other condition that ISSCR talked about is around expanded access. Now, expanded access, basically clinical trials are ways we predominantly test unproven drugs, and this is of course FDA regulated. Expanded access programs are, again, within the purview of medicine. Their goals are to give care. They also are overseen through FDA and also require institutional review board ethics approval. Now, right to try is a parallel pathway to expanded access. It has lost a lot of fewer requirements. There is, for example, no FDA review, and there's also no IRB review in right to try. Now, expanded access can occur from a single patient to an intermediate size patient population, perhaps 10 to several dozen, maybe even up to 100. And then, of course, there's a treatment group population. They can also be done for emergency and non-emergency purposes. And the FDA is pretty quick to review and oversee this process. It also has been shown to be giving quite a bit of helpful information in terms of how to best administer the protocol or how to best monitor. And so, and it's very quick. This is not like submitting an IND for a clinical trial. The process itself is a lot quicker, and the FDA has approved over 99% of these expanded access requests. Now, the criteria for expanded access is really reliant on the physician. The physician must first certify that a patient is ineligible for a clinical trial and has exhausted all of the other therapeutic options. They must have a serious disease or condition or an immediately life-threatening disease or condition, and these are defined in regulations. I'm not going to go over them. Also, the physician must show that there's a benefit to risk ratio, a favorable benefit to risk ratio, that the chances of this expanded access, a drug may or biologic may be may be beneficial to the patient. And of course, it cannot displace a clinical trial. So giving a stem cell product outside of a clinical trial can't harm the ongoing development of that product. So a physician really has to first seek sponsor approval. A company really reserves the right to refuse a stem cell intervention to a patient. The FDA then has to oversee it, and there has to be ethics approval at the local institution. Now, there are also issues with stem cell interventions being offered via expanded access. So firstly, as ISSCR notes, medical innovation should be done on a few patients, but in the US, there are, again, single patient intermediate populations and treatment populations. So where exactly are a few patients? What exactly does a few mean? Can it be, certainly probably not on a treatment level, but maybe intermediate can be up to 100 patients or so. Is this really what ISSCR wants? And again, greater guidance and direction may be good. Also, there may be situations where a company who's out there to really make profit as opposed to help patients may put a very simple clinical trial and submit an IND. And in that sense, now this stem cell product is within that FDA pipeline of doing clinical trials. Can now that company or another company actually use that product to be able to charge patients and give that product through expanded access pathways. Now, the FDA does not allow profit to be made through expanded access or even through right to try. The provision is actually from the FDA regulations and the right to try law. But there have been ways to sort of skirt around that issue. So there's private equity firms in the oncology space that charge patients, not to make profit. That charge patients for unique access. So the FDA regulates and says that you can charge only for manufacturing and or shipping, things like that. You can't make a profit. But these private equity firms can actually charge for, a consultation where they're, putting patients in touch with companies who may be able to give their experimental product through a right to try pathway, but potentially also through an expanded access pathway. So this just shows that maybe there may be ways to sort of circumvent the provisions that are outlined by the ISSCR. And so better ways to address these issues in subsequent documents may be good. So again, I hope I've been able to show you that the ISSCR really is an international standard, but as guidelines, they are non-mandatory and therefore do not have the same force as regulations which operate within a country. Now, of course, the ISSCR guidelines have now narrowed the scope of medical innovation because they're again concerned that it may become standard of care instead of going through the clinical trials process. And some of the brief critiques that I've given showed that there may be areas where greater information is needed to ensure proper practices and to potentially close loopholes in ISSCR guidance surrounding, again, off-label and expanded access. And I want to also give a final big picture point, which is that, we're talking about guidance and we're talking about the conduct of, scientific practices and clinical practices. But at the end of the day, we must not forget that this is all a regulatory type of an approach, and more work really needs to be done to understand how patients think about this and to provide patients other options and information so as to be able to combat sort of the misin and disinformation that is prevalent in this industry. So again, I'd like to thank Bernie for the invite to talk to all of you today. Some of our funders that have been generously supporting the various research studies that were done from our group, including from the NIH, and wonderful colleagues, all mentioned over here, that have been part of these studies, and of course the artists that I've used to make this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much and have a great day.